Korea's boom time is over. And I think a lot of Korean people don't realize that that's perfectly okay. I remember quite some time ago on my university campus, I was sitting there waiting for my shuttle bus to come and take me off of campus, and I heard these two quite older professors talking about how it's much harder now to become a professor than it was when they were becoming a professor. And this was like the mid-2000s, this was quite some time ago. So these guys probably became a professor in the 70s. And now in America, our boom time was the 50s and the 60s and maybe to a lesser extent the 70s, but especially for professors, because you may or may not know this, but we have a huge generation boom after World War II. We call that generation the baby boomers, because after World War II, a lot of people had a lot of kids. So all of those kids were starting to go to university in the 60s and 70s, and as such, there was a huge, much bigger demand for professors than there is now. So these professors were talking about how it's a lot harder to become a professor nowadays than it used to be. And in fact, I experienced this secondhand through my brother, because my brother tried to become a professor and he did everything right. Number one, he's a smart enough guy. Number two, he went to a very good university. Number three, his field is even a subject that is not humanities, that is very marketable, very much able to go to a private sector job, and thus there's a lot less competition in his field in academia. Finally, his wife had a job where she's very flexible, and she was actually able to move with him anywhere he needed to go to get that job. And yet with all of these things in his favor, and he worked as hard as he could, he still couldn't become a professor. And that's because it's no longer a boom time in America. It's no longer America's economic boom time, especially in academia. And we know that in America. We know that the 50s and 60s were the boom time, and we know that they're over. And as much as we wish we could have those boom times where it was really easy to get a job, where it was possible to have a one-income family that could really support the whole family and have enough money to save and to own your own house and to buy a new car and go on vacation, as much as those times are gone, we don't really care that much as Korean people do. And I think there's several reasons why. First, the people in Korea who really benefited from this economic boom time in Korea are still around. They're not that old. They're in their 50s and 60s. Let's define Korea's boom time as the 80s and 90s. Those guys who had all the economic advantages of being able to get a really good job fairly easily, of being able to start a business and have that business be successful. Take the example of being a professor like I gave before. I had a Korean friend who is trying desperately to become a professor now, and he goes to a very good university and everything is in his favor in that way. Both of his parents are professors, and he told me something that was absolutely shocking, which was his father became a professor without a PhD. His father became a professor with just a master's degree, and I was absolutely floored, because in America every single professor has to have a PhD, and it's been like that for a long time. But I guess a long time ago, during Korea's boom period, there just weren't enough people with PhDs to fill all the spots necessary for professors. So it was a lot easier to become a professor back then, and all of those benefits were there. And those people who got those benefits in America's boom time, they're all quite old, if not dead. Whereas those people in Korea are still alive, and not only are they alive, but due to Korean culture and the way that Korea works, old people are supposed to pass on their wisdom to younger people, whether the younger people want to hear it or not. And I would think that would kind of compound how bad it is for younger people in Korea now that are not in Korea's boom time to have to get through it. The other problem with how Korean people are thinking about the boom times is their point of reference, whom they are comparing themselves to. So you're either comparing yourself to your parents' generation, where it was the 80s and 90s and shit was really easy. People, I don't want to say really easy, but it was a lot easier to start a business. It was a lot easier to get a relatively good job that was middle class and nice, and you could support your family on it. And if they're not comparing themselves to now, because I've heard so many times, oh, 옛날에 진짜 blah 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 blah, 요즘에 진짜 힘들어요. I've heard this so many times. If young Korean people aren't comparing themselves to that generation, they're comparing themselves to Americans. And not only are they comparing themselves to Americans, they're comparing themselves to this dream idea they have of Americans, this dream idea they have of what the American life is. I've heard so many times Korean people say, well, in Korea, it's hard to get a job. In Korea, it's hard to get into university. I'm gonna fucking set you straight. It's hard to get a job in America too. It's hard to get into a really good university in America too. Might be easier than Korea, and there might be different ways and tactics, but it doesn't make it easy. If you want to see how economically difficult it is in America, if you want to see the real life of what's really going on in America, Google search percent of income Americans spend on transportation. You know, it's really nice to have a good public transportation. In America, in a lot of cities at least, you must own a car, which means you have to buy the car, you have to insure the car, you have to pay for repairs. It takes a huge amount of your income just to get from point A to point B. Look up percentage of income spent on healthcare. Look up percentage of income spent on rent or on mortgage. I guarantee you all of those things are higher, if not much higher, than it is in Korea. But Korean people don't see that. They just have this idea that America's the richest country in the world, thus things economically must be much easier there, and there must be many more opportunities, which is sometimes true, but not always true. But if you have this frame of reference where you're comparing your life to the people who are way better than you, and even the people that don't actually exist, these fantasy of what America is, it's going to make yourself feel a lot worse about your situation, whether it's compared to that fanciful country or compared to 옛날에 when Korean people were having a real economic boom. Finally, the hardest thing I think Korean people have when thinking about the economic opportunities now compared to how it used to be is the way that Korean people think about complaining. Honestly, it's one of the hardest things for me about Korean people is the way that Korean people complain, because complaining is not always looked at as a bad thing in Korea. Oftentimes, Korean people love to commiserate with each other. They love to say, things are very difficult for me. It's very hard to get a job these days. And then the other person says, yes, it is very hard to get a job. It's also difficult for me. And everyone pats each other on the back, goes, 힘들어, yes, 힘들어, 힘들어, 힘들어. And it's again, this problem of not seeing the big picture. And I don't want to take anything away. Crazy 야근, having to do albu at 회식, all this bullshit about working in Korea really does suck. But the difference is in America, we complain, but after you complain a certain amount, somebody sets you straight, because we don't want to hear that shit. And we put it in perspective. So if you sit there and go like, oh, my job is really hard, you say like, well, at least you're not, scrubbing toilets. Yeah, but it's, I barely have enough money to get by. Hey, at least you don't live in fucking Vietnam where like people are hungry and starving and you can't feed your kids. And, one of the things I always try to tell Korean people is Korea is the 13th richest country in the world. So every time a Korean person's complaining to me, I'm just saying, look, man, you know that you're in a country that's richer than 180 other countries. What I can never understand is how Korean people could be so open and free with complaining when just 60 years ago, this very country that Korean people are in was much harder, was much poorer. I've heard stories of Korean people putting bark into soup to eat soup. Maybe this is just North Korean stories, but a long time ago, Korea was really bad. And I think Korean people nowadays, they know that exists, but when you complain with your Korean friends in Korea, you guys don't set each other straight and put it into perspective. You just pat each other on the back and go, oh yes, you're having a hard life, I'm having a hard life, all of us are having a hard life. Isn't life shitty? Whereas in America, at least, I don't know what to say about other Western countries, in America, we don't take that. And because of that, we don't feel so bad about it not being our boom period anymore. So for these three reasons, number one, our people who hit the boom period are kind of gone and are dead and don't tell us about how we should be living our lives and don't rub in our face that they had a much easier or more economic opportunities than we do. Because of that, and because Americans don't compare themselves to some mythical country that's much richer than us, that's doing much better than us, and because of just the general way that we don't accept complaining and the way that we put people who are complaining into their own perspective, for Americans, the fact that it's no longer a boom time anymore doesn't affect us as much as it does Korean people.